The first thing my mother-in-law ever asked me to do in that old house was something I thought I would easily forget. She asked me to stay away from one particular room at the time. I did not understand why. I had been married for a little over a year when my husband and I started spending weekends at his family's old country house. It was not the kind of place I would have chosen for myself. The house was large, quiet, and much older than anything I had ever lived in. The wooden floors creaked whenever someone walked across them, and almost every room contained something that seemed to belong to another time. Still, I liked the house. There was something peaceful about it. It stood at the end of a narrow road, surrounded by tall trees and an overgrown garden. Behind the house was a small orchard, and in spring the entire place smelled of apples and damp earth. My mother-in-law, Margaret, had lived there for many years before moving into a smaller apartment in town. She still visited the house regularly. At first, I assumed she came to take care of the garden and check the condition of the building. But after several weekends, I began noticing that she always went upstairs alone. There were 4 bedrooms on the second floor and one small room at the very end of the hallway. That room was different from the others. Its door was always locked. I noticed it during our first visit, but I did not ask about it. I assumed it was being used for storage. Then, one Saturday morning, while I was cleaning the hallway, Margaret suddenly appeared behind me. She looked toward the small door, then she looked at me, without saying anything. She made it clear that I was never supposed to enter that room. I remember feeling slightly uncomfortable, but I accepted it. Every family has private things. Every old house has rooms full of forgotten objects. I had no reason to interfere. For several months, I kept my distance, but the more time I spent in that house, the more curious I became. The strange thing was that Margaret did not behave as though she simply wanted to keep a storage room private. She checked the lock every time she came upstairs. Sometimes she would stand in front of the door for several seconds without touching it. Once, I saw her holding an old photograph in her hand while looking at the room. When she noticed me, she immediately put the photograph away. I said nothing, neither did she. I decided that whatever was behind that door was none of my business. That changed one rainy afternoon. My husband had gone into town, and Margaret had asked me to help her sort through some boxes in the downstairs hallway. The rain became heavier as the afternoon continued. Eventually, Margaret went outside to bring some things in from the porch. I stayed inside while moving one of the boxes. I noticed an old wooden frame underneath a pile of newspapers. I picked it up. It contained a photograph of the house from many years ago. The garden looked completely different. There were fewer trees. The windows were new, and several people stood in front of the house. I recognized Margaret immediately, although she looked much younger. Beside her stood a woman I had never seen before. The woman was holding a little girl by the hand. I assumed the girl was my husband's sister, but something about the photograph made me stop. The little girl looked strangely familiar. I studied her face for several seconds. Then, I turned the photograph over. There was a date written on the back. It was from more than 30 years earlier. Under the date were only 2 words, one name, and a sentence. I read it twice because I could not believe what I was seeing. The name was not my husband's sister. It was another woman's name, a woman I had never heard mentioned in the family. I put the photograph back exactly where I had found it. When Margaret returned, I noticed that she looked unusually tense. She gathered the boxes quickly and told me we should stop for the day. I did not ask about the photograph, but that evening, I could not stop thinking about it, especially about the woman standing beside Margaret, and about the locked room upstairs. The next morning, Margaret left the house earlier than usual. Before leaving, she checked the upstairs hallway. I watched from the bottom of the stairs. She walked toward the locked room, touched the handle, and remained there for a moment. Then she turned around and walked away. Something about the way she looked at that door stayed with me. It was not anger. It was not fear. It looked more like regret. That was when I began to wonder whether the locked room had anything to do with the woman in the photograph. I Did not intend to investigate. At least. That was what I told myself, but 3 weeks later, I found another clue. It was inside an old wooden cabinet in the dining room. I had been looking for a tablecloth when I found a small envelope hidden behind several folded sheets. There was no address on it, only my mother-in-law's name. The envelope had been opened long ago. Inside was a single photograph. It showed the same woman from the first picture. This time, she was standing alone in front of the house. On the back was another date, and beneath it, a short handwritten sentence. I suddenly understood why Margaret had never wanted me near that upstairs room. Whatever had happened all those years ago had not been forgotten. It had simply been locked away, and I was beginning to suspect that Margaret had been carrying that secret for most of her life. I put the photograph back into the envelope, but before I could close the cabinet, I noticed something else. A small brass key was lying underneath the envelope. I recognized it immediately. It looked exactly like the key Margaret used for the locked room upstairs. For several minutes, I simply stared at it. I knew I should put it back. I knew I should forget everything I had seen, but curiosity is dangerous when it is mixed with the feeling that someone has deliberately kept the truth from you. I took the key, and that evening, for the first time, I walked upstairs alone. I stood in front of the locked door for a long time before I finally put the key into the lock. I still had the chance to walk away. Part of me wanted to, but another part of me felt that I had already crossed a line the moment I took the key from the cabinet. The lock turned easily. The door opened with a quiet creak. I expected to find boxes, old furniture, perhaps clothes or papers that had been forgotten over the years. Instead, the room looked almost untouched. There was a narrow bed against one wall, a small wooden desk near the window, and several shelves filled with books. Dust covered almost everything, but it was obvious that someone had once cared about this room very much. There were photographs on the walls. I stepped closer. The same woman appeared in almost every picture. Sometimes she was alone. Sometimes she stood beside Margaret. In several photographs, she was holding the same little girl I had seen in the old family photograph. I began to understand that this woman had once been an important part of the family. But why had I never heard about her? I moved toward the desk. There were several notebooks stacked neatly inside the drawer. The first pages contained ordinary things: dates, grocery lists, small notes about the garden. Then the writing changed. The entries became more personal. They described a young woman who had lived in the house and who seemed to have been struggling with something that I could not completely understand. I did not read everything. I felt uncomfortable invading someone's private memories, but one particular page caught my attention. It mentioned a little girl. The girl had been brought to the house after something had happened to her mother. I read the sentence several times. Then I saw the date. It was the same year as the photograph. My hands became cold. The little girl had not been Margaret's daughter. She was the daughter of the woman in the photographs, and suddenly another question became much more important. Where had that girl gone? I continued looking through the room. On one shelf stood a small wooden box. Inside were several children's belongings: a ribbon, a tiny bracelet, a faded drawing, and a photograph. The photograph showed the little girl sitting on the front steps of the house. On the back was her name. It was a name I recognized. I had seen it before, not in the family. In an old document I had once come across while helping my husband organize paperwork. I realized then that the little girl had grown up. She had not disappeared. She had simply disappeared from this family's story. I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to understand what I was looking at. Why would Margaret erase someone from the family's history? Why would she lock away every photograph and every memory? And why had she never told me? Before I could find an answer, I heard a car outside. Margaret had returned. I quickly put everything back. The photographs went exactly where I had found them. The notebook returned to the drawer. The little box went back onto the shelf. I closed the door and locked it again. Then I hid the key in my pocket. When Margaret came inside, I could immediately tell that she knew something was different. She went upstairs. I followed a few minutes later. The locked door was still closed. but Margaret stood in front of it for a long time. She did not open it. She simply touched the handle, then she walked